Okay, here we go. It's time for another vocal lesson in the van. Okay, right about now, I'd like to talk about something really important when it comes to using the voice. We are talking about controlling the tongue. By now, you might have, if you've watched any of the previous lessons, you'll know that we've established that the tongue is the medium through which we make our sounds. And basically, controlling the tongue is paramount to making healthy, good, clear sound and diction. Also, it comes in handy for controlling tone in the voice. Now, let me just do this volume a little bit lower here. Not on the video, but in this room, so I don't get too much feedback. Okay, right, so basically we established that you've got the front of the tongue, da-da-da-da-da, the middle of the tongue, g-g-g-g-g, and got the very back of the tongue, g-g-g-g-g, at the very back of the horns, the hyoid horns. But what I'd like to talk about today is efficiency and safety. Two aspects when it comes to using the tongue that one really wants to be in control of, and that really sort of trumps up as highly important when it comes to making healthy sounds. Now, although we've got many parts of the tongue, and although the very back part of the tongue that connects to the hyoid horns are very good place to actually grab hold of and actually lever the voice, lever the tilt of the larynx. But what we're talking about is the most efficient way now of doing that. Now, in a previous lesson, I did describe that if you can get right behind those horns and yank them, you are in the most efficient place when it comes to producing the maximum amount of sound. I call that chest register production. But one of the things about that, in that area, there's also the jaw muscle, this underneath muscle here, which I do believe is the junior glossus muscle. That comes from the back of underneath of the tongue, and it grows downwards into the hyoid bone. But there's also another muscle which runs the actual, from the chin bone to the glossus muscle, to the hyoid bone as well. These are chin muscles and jaw muscles. Those muscles are not used for vocal production. And one of the things that one can run into when trying to get to the very bottom of those horns is one could be mistaking the pull of the actual muscle, the hyglossus muscle, for the tensioning of those muscles, or either of those muscles, especially the junior glossus muscle, which is the one that runs underneath the tongue at the front part, which pulls the tongue outwards. That's not the muscle we want to use for vocal production, because that one is not connected directly to the vocal cords. Sorry, not the vocal cords, the vocal box. But what they do is they connect toward the hyglossus muscle. And if they are tensioning, they can interfere with the tension of the hyglossus muscle, which wants to run this way, and the junior glossus wants to pull that way. So you could say, if you're tensing this muscle, you're interfering with the movement of the hyglossus muscles, which will just want to go up and down and tilt that larynx. So in order to not do that, or risk doing that, there's certain areas you can stay on the tongue which sort of make it impossible for you to grab hold of the wrong muscle, so to speak. So what you want to do, there's something in the tongue called the dorsum of the tongue, which is the whole top part of the tongue. Da-da-da-da, ga-ga-ga-ga, talked about the top of the back, and of course the bottom of the back, the hyglossae at the bottom, which is the part that's a bit close to the genio and the other chin muscle, which you don't want to activate. So basically, in realizing that, I have found that the safest place to approach the hyglossus muscle is from the top downwards. So if you're going to place a g-g-g-g-g, by holding the g in the what I call the middle of the tongue or the top of the back, g, which is still the hypoglossal muscle. It's just that rather than grabbing it from under here and risking catching onto something else, you're grabbing it from here and you're yanking it that way. Gug. So one can still access very thick, full, chesty register registration sound. One can go or go. Now that is the area that I've likened to the mix area, and perhaps it exactly is, because if I place the there, under my hard palate, then I'm obviously accessing head registration because I'm getting a pulse and an explosion that is right underneath the hard palate. That's going to send tones into the head much more than placing it back here, which is in the soft palate. By placing it in the soft palate, it allowed me to get chest registration and head registration. So you could call this the mixed registration, the safest place to actually attack and place your pulse. Now, in the other lesson, we also talked about pulse and sustain. So if you pulse in the mixed register or head register, any of these areas, the whole dorsum, the whole top of the tongue, if you save those places as the safest places for pulsing, for starting tone, then what you can do is still sustain in different areas. You can sustain in the back, go, so you can still pull in all that anchorage from the back, but starting in the top. That way you're not going to grab hold of different muscles. Or you can sustain in that middle area, go, and you're still yanking the back, but from a different position, from a position where there's no chance of you involving the jaw muscles, which might feel very solid and stable, but they're the wrong muscle for vocal production. So what one could, in a sense, be doing is neutralizing the effect of their hypoglossal muscle, which is there to keep the cords safe. And by that being neutralized, that means the cords are going to be coming together and maybe vibrating, touching against each other where they wouldn't be if it was just a hypoglossal muscle being used. So, so that's the story of the most efficient way to use the tongue. Pronounce in the dorsum. The dorsum is all the parts that move above, the top parts of the tongue, and control the hypoglossals from there. So even if it's a tip of the tongue sound, like do, I'm keeping my sustaining in the upper parts of the tongue. Do, 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 starting there in the front and sustaining in the mixed register, as opposed to going down into chest, which with skill and practice can be done, and for effect can be done, but we're talking about safety here and not weight. So if I want to go into that chesty area, I would want to make sure that I've at least pulsed at the beginning, so I know I'm in the tongue and not in the jaw. Do, and then I can allow that back part to lift into it. Do, because you very much can feel those horns moving when you relax it all. You just don't want to risk mixing it with jaw or chin muscles. Okay, so that about wraps up this lesson. We're going to keep it nice and short. Don't forget, get to control your tongue and keep it in the dorsum. Use the dorsum for pronunciation and pulse and sustain. And safest places for pulsing and sustaining, or at least definitely a place to practice, and in my opinion, the safest place is to pulse and sustain in the dorsum of the tongue. There we go.